When Walls Come Down. The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's Private Medical Center cast their usual sterile glow as Elena Vasquez made her way down the marble-floored corridor. Her soft-soled shoes whispered against the polished surface, sound she'd grown accustomed to during her 3 years working the night shift in the VIP wing. At 28, she'd seen enough entitled patients to develop a healthy skepticism toward the ultra-wealthy who populated these exclusive rooms. Tonight felt different, though she couldn't pinpoint why. The usual parade of celebrity overdoses, and politicians' wives recovering from exhaustion filled most of the wing. But room 314 housed someone new. Marcus Blackwood, the tech mogul whose face graced business magazines and financial news programs. According to his chart, he'd been admitted 12 hours ago after collapsing during a board meeting. Elena paused outside his door, checking her tablet. The man who'd revolutionized cloud computing and amassed a fortune worth billions was listed as having acute exhaustion and dehydration. She'd heard whispers from the day-shift nurses about how demanding he'd been, snapping at anyone who dared interrupt his phone calls or suggest he actually rest. She knocked gently and entered without waiting for a response, a habit she'd developed after too many patients pretended to be asleep to avoid taking medication. What she found stopped her in her tracks. Marcus Blackwood wasn't the imposing figure she'd expected. Instead of the sharp-suited titan of industry, she saw a man sitting on the pristine white floor beside his hospital bed, still wearing the patient gown that somehow made him look smaller, more human. His dark hair, usually perfectly styled in photos, fell messily across his forehead. His phone lay shattered against the far wall, its screen a spiderweb of cracks. Mr. Blackwood. Elena's voice was gentler than she'd planned. "I'm Elena, your night nurse. Are you all right?" He looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes that held a devastation she recognized but rarely saw in this wing. The powerful Marcus Blackwood, worth more money than most small countries, was crying. "She's gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Claire, my sister. She's gone, and I wasn't there. I was never there." Elena had learned not to get too involved with patients' personal dramas, but something in his voice made her abandon protocol. She moved closer, her training as a nurse overriding her cynicism about wealthy patients. "What happened?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him rather than towering above. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, leaving it even more disheveled. "Car accident. 3 hours ago. She was driving to see me, actually. First time in 2 years she'd reached out. And He gestured helplessly at the broken phone. "I was too busy with some merger to take her call yesterday. Too important to call her back." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the quiet hum of medical equipment. Elena had seen grief before. Raw, ugly, all-consuming grief that stripped away pretense and left people naked in their pain. This was that kind of grief. She was only 26, Marcus continued, as if Elena hadn't been sitting there for the past 5 minutes in silence. Brilliant artist, could paint things that made you see the world differently. But I never told her that. Never had time to visit her gallery showings or see her apartment in Brooklyn. I sent money instead. Like that was the same thing. Elena found herself leaning forward, drawn into his pain despite herself. "Tell me about her," she said softly. For the next hour, Marcus talked about Claire, about her laugh, her terrible cooking, the way she'd call him Marky, even after he'd built his empire. Elena listened, occasionally asking questions, watching. This powerful man crumble as he realized all his success meant nothing without the people he'd left behind. When he finally fell asleep in that chair, Elena covered him with a blanket and dimmed the lights, wondering why she felt like something fundamental had shifted in the sterile halls of St. Catherine's. Conversations in the dark. The second night brought an unexpected rhythm to Elena's rounds. She found herself saving room 314 for last, though she told herself it was simply because Marcus had been sleeping better toward the end of her shift. The truth was more complicated. Something about their conversation the night before had lodged itself in her chest, a recognition she wasn't ready to examine too closely. When she entered his room at 2:47 a.m., Marcus was awake, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights below. He'd moved from the floor to the armchair, but still wore the same haunted expression that had startled her the night before. "Can't sleep?" Elena asked, checking his vitals on the monitor display. "Sleep feels like giving up," he said without turning around. "Like if I close my eyes, I'm accepting that she's really gone." Elena had heard variations of this from dozens of grieving patients, but something about Marcus's delivery, matter of fact, rather than self-pitying, made her pause in her routine chart updates. "The funeral is tomorrow," he continued. "Private service. I hired the best funeral director in the city, bought her the most beautiful casket, arranged for flowers from that shop she loved in Soho. All the things I should have done when she was alive." What would she have wanted? Elena found herself asking. Marcus finally turned from the window, studying Elena with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of her practical scrubs and hastily pulled back hair. Something simple, probably. She hated fuss. Used to say I threw money at problems instead of actually solving them. Was she right? The question hung between them, more direct than Elena usually allowed herself to be with patients. But something about the late hour and Marcus's raw honesty made normal boundaries feel artificial. "Always," Marcus admitted with a bitter laugh. "Claire had this way of seeing straight through all my justifications. She'd ask me when I last took a vacation, or read a book that wasn't about business, or had a conversation that didn't involve profit margins. I'd get defensive, tell her she didn't understand the pressure, the responsibility of running a company that employed thousands of people." Elena settled into the visitor's chair, abandoning any pretense of continuing her rounds. But she understood something else. "That I was running," Marcus said quietly. "Always running from the kid who grew up in foster care, who wore the same 3 shirts to school and pretended he wasn't hungry when lunch money ran out. She used to say I'd built my entire life around making sure I never felt powerless again. But in doing that, I'd made myself powerless in different ways." The words struck Elena unexpectedly deep. She thought of her own father, Roberto, who'd worked double shifts at the factory for 20 years, chasing overtime pay and promotion promises that never quite materialized, who'd missed her high school graduation for a mandatory Saturday shift, and died of a heart attack at 52, still believing that success was always just one more paycheck away. "My father was the same," Elena said before she could stop herself. "Different circumstances, same trap. He worked himself to death trying to give our family a better life, but we would have been happier with less money and more of him." Marcus looked at her with sudden focus. "What did you do? After he died?" "Nursing school. Partly to help people, partly because I swore I'd never lose myself in work the way he did. But then—" Elena paused, realizing she was sharing more than she ever did with patients. "But then I started picking up extra shifts, covering for other nurses, staying late to check on patients who reminded me of him. My mom says I'm becoming just like him." "Are you?" The question was gentle but pointed. Elena considered deflecting, returning to her professional role. But something about the darkness and their shared understanding of loss made honesty feel necessary. "Maybe. I tell myself it's different because I'm helping people, not just making money. But I haven't taken a real vacation in 2 years. I eat dinner standing up in the break room more often than sitting at my own table. I can't remember the last book I read that wasn't a medical journal." Marcus nodded slowly. "Claire used to paint these incredible cityscapes. Not pretty postcards, but real portraits of urban loneliness. She'd show me these paintings of people in office buildings, working late with their faces lit by computer screens, and I'd think they were beautiful but depressing. It never occurred to me that she was painting me." They sat in comfortable silence. two strangers united by the recognition of their own patterns, their own ways of hiding from life while pretending to live it fully. Outside, the city hummed with its endless activity. Other people working through the night, chasing their own versions of enough. "What happens now?" Elena asked. "After the funeral?" Marcus was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know. For the first time in 15 years, I honestly have no idea what happens next." Elena found that answer oddly comforting. In a wing full of people who had everything figured out, at least on the surface, there was something refreshing about someone admitting they were lost. When her shift ended at 7 a.m., Elena realized she'd spent nearly 3 hours in room 314, the longest she'd ever lingered with a single patient. As she gathered her things, she wondered if Marcus would still be there when she returned that evening, and was surprised by how much she hoped the answer would be yes. The weight of success. Elena arrived for her third night to find Marcus, dressed in an expensive suit, pacing his room like a caged animal. The funeral, she realized, checking the time. It would have been this afternoon. "How did it go?" she asked, softly, noting the untouched dinner tray and the way his hands shook slightly as he loosened his tie. "Like a performance," Marcus said, his voice hollow. 300 people who barely knew her, talking about what a lovely young woman she was. Business associates offering condolences that sounded like networking opportunities. The mayor gave a speech about supporting the arts, even though the city just cut funding for the program where Claire taught kids to paint. He collapsed into the armchair, suddenly looking exhausted. "Her best friend, Rosie, barely spoke to me. She knew. She knew that Claire had been trying to reconnect, that she'd been calling me for months about getting coffee, maybe visiting the studio where she'd been working on this new series." Elena watched him carefully. The raw grief from the first night had crystallized into something harder, more complex. What was the series about? Family? Marcus laughed bitterly. She'd been painting these incredible portraits of siblings, some close, some estranged, some finding their way back to each other. Rosie showed me photos on her phone. Claire had titled the series "Almost Home." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Elena felt the familiar tug of wanting to comfort him, to offer the kind of professional sympathy she'd been trained to provide, but something held her back. Maybe it was the memory of her father's funeral, where people had praised his work ethic, as if dying for a paycheck was noble rather than tragic. "She was painting her way back to you," Elena said instead. Marcus looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Artists process things differently than the rest of us. Maybe those paintings weren't just about family in general. Maybe they were her way of working through how to bridge the gap between you. But I never saw them. Never even knew they existed until today. Because you were too busy building walls to notice someone trying to climb them." The words came out, harsher than Elena intended, and she immediately regretted them. This was exactly why she usually maintained professional distance. It was too easy to project her own unresolved feelings onto patients' situations. But Marcus didn't look offended. Instead, he leaned forward, studying her face. "You're angry." "I'm not at me, at yourself, for doing the same thing." Elena felt exposed, as if he'd somehow seen through the careful composure she maintained during every shift. "I should check on my other patients." "Elena, wait." Marcus stood, blocking her path to the door. "Talk to me. What walls are you building?" Against her better judgment, Elena found herself staying, drawn by the genuine concern in his voice. No patient had ever asked about her walls before. Most barely acknowledged she existed beyond her function as their caregiver. "It's different," she said weakly. "Is it? You work 16-hour shifts when you could work 12. You take on extra patients. You skip breaks to sit with people who remind you of your father. When do you live your own life?" The accuracy of his observation stung. Elena thought of her apartment, the one her mother constantly reminded her she was never in. The gym membership she'd never used. The Spanish language classes she'd signed up for twice but never attended. The dates she'd declined because she was too tired or had picked up an extra shift. "At least I'm helping people," she said defensively. So, was I, or that's what I told myself. Do you know how many jobs Blackwood Technologies created? How many families depend on the paychecks I generate? I used to recite those statistics whenever Claire questioned my priorities. Elena saw where he was heading. It's not the same thing, isn't it? We both found noble reasons to avoid the messiness of actually connecting with people. I built a company. You built a career in caring for others. Both require sacrifice, both serve important purposes, and both can become prisons if we're not careful. Before Elena could respond, her pager buzzed urgently. Room 298, Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who'd been recovering from surgery. Elena's stomach clenched. Mrs. Patterson reminded her painfully of her grandmother, and she'd been checking on her more frequently than protocol required. "I have to go," Elena said, but Marcus caught her arm gently. "What room?" 2298. Mrs. Patterson. She's been having complications and Elena trailed off, realizing what she was about to admit. "And you've been taking extra care of her because she reminds you of someone." Elena nodded reluctantly, then hurried toward the door. As she rushed down the hallway, she could hear Marcus following behind her, which should have annoyed her, but somehow didn't. Mrs. Patterson was experiencing chest pain and difficulty breathing. Elena immediately called for the on-call physician while checking vitals and administering oxygen. For the next hour, she moved with practiced efficiency, monitoring, adjusting, comforting the frightened woman while the medical team worked to stabilize her condition. Through it all, she was acutely aware of Marcus standing quietly in the corner, watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. When Mrs. Patterson was finally stable and sleeping peacefully, Elena realized she was shaking. "You're incredible at this," Marcus said softly as they walked back toward his room. "Watching you with her. You weren't just providing medical care. You were providing hope." Elena felt tears threatening, exhaustion and emotion combining, in a dangerous mix. "She's going to be fine. Her daughter is flying in tomorrow. But you're not sure she would have been if you hadn't been paying such close attention." Elena stopped walking. "That's my job." "No," Marcus said firmly. "Your job is to monitor patients and provide care. What you did tonight was love someone back to health. There's a difference." Standing in the quiet hallway, Elena finally understood why Marcus's breakdown had affected her so deeply. They were both people who'd learned to hide their deepest selves behind their work. But tonight, she'd seen something different. The possibility that caring deeply didn't have to mean losing yourself completely. "Maybe some walls serve a purpose," she said quietly. "And maybe some need to come down," Marcus replied. "The question is figuring out which is which." Beyond the hospital walls, Elena arrived for her fourth shift to find an unusual buzz of activity around the nurses' station. Linda, the head nurse, looked up with barely concealed irritation as Elena approached. "Your patient in 314 has extended his stay," Linda said curtly. "Claims he needs additional rest for complete recovery, but his vitals have been normal for 2 days. Dr. Morrison thinks he's malingering." Elena felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite name. Relief mixed with concern. What does that mean for his care plan? "It means you need to maintain appropriate professional boundaries." Linda's tone was sharp. "I've heard you've been spending considerable time in that room. Remember, these VIP patients aren't your friends. They live in a different world, and when they leave here, they forget people like us exist." The words stung because Elena feared they might be true. As she made her way to room 314, she wondered if she'd been naive to think her conversations with Marcus meant anything beyond a wealthy man's temporary need for distraction from his grief. She found him at his laptop, looking more like the businessman from magazine covers. His hair was styled, he wore expensive pajamas instead of the hospital gown, and the vulnerable man she'd connected with seemed replaced by someone more polished, more distant. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood," she said, deliberately formal. "How are you feeling tonight?" Marcus looked up, immediately picking up on the change in her tone. "Elena? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I'm just doing my job." She busied herself, checking his chart, avoiding eye contact. "Dr. Morrison wants to discuss your discharge plans tomorrow. Your test results show you're fully recovered." "I know." Marcus closed the laptop and moved closer. "I've been making arrangements to extend my stay. I told them I'm still experiencing fatigue and want to be cautious." Elena finally looked at him directly. "Are you experiencing fatigue?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning they both understood. Marcus had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Not physically, no." "Then why are you still here?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched him struggle with an honesty that clearly didn't come easily. "Because for the first time in years, I'm having conversations that matter. Because someone is asking me questions that don't involve profit margins or stock prices, because you're bored and I'm a novelty." The words came out sharper than Elena intended, fueled by Linda's warnings and her own fears. "No," Marcus's voice was firm, "because you're the first person in years who's seen me as a human being instead of a bank account or a business opportunity." Elena wanted to believe him, but Linda's words echoed in her mind. "What happens when you leave here? When you go back to your real life?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but I'd like to find out. Have dinner with me." "I'm working. After your shift." "There's a place I know, a place you know," Elena interrupted. "Let me guess. Somewhere that costs more than I make in a month. Somewhere I'd need to buy a dress I can't afford to fit in?" Marcus looked taken aback. "I didn't mean I could take you anywhere you'd like." "That's exactly the problem." Elena's frustration boiled over. "You think you can solve everything with money? You want to take me to dinner? Fine. But not at some fancy restaurant where I'll feel like a charity case. Not somewhere you'd take a business associate or a date you want to impress." "Then where?" Elena hadn't expected him to ask. She'd expected him to make excuses, to realize that navigating her world would be more complicated than throwing money at the problem. "There's a diner about 6 blocks from here. Rosita's. It's where the hospital staff goes when we get off late shifts. It's loud, the coffee's terrible, and the booths have duct tape holding them together." "Sounds perfect. You don't understand. You'll be the only person there in a suit that costs more than most people's cars. People will stare." Marcus smiled, and for a moment she saw the vulnerable man from their first night again. "Let them stare. I've been hiding behind expensive suits and boardrooms for so long, I've forgotten what the real world looks like." Despite herself, Elena felt her resistance wavering. But before she could respond, her pager buzzed. Another patient needed attention, then another. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of medical emergencies and routine care, and she didn't get back to Marcus's room until nearly dawn. She found him asleep in the chair by the window, still in his expensive pajamas, his laptop open to what looked like emails. Elena studied his face in the early morning light, the sharp cheekbones that looked good in photographs, the lines of stress that no amount of money could erase, the way his hands were still slightly clenched even in sleep. On his laptop screen, she could see the subject lines of his emails: board meeting rescheduled, quarterly projections, acquisition update. His real world, calling him back to the life he'd built as armor against ever feeling powerless again. Elena found herself wondering if people could really change, or if they just convinced themselves they wanted to, while circumstances allowed for the illusion. Marcus wanted to have dinner at a diner now, but what about when his grief faded and the novelty of slumming it with hospital staff wore off? As she prepared to leave, Marcus stirred awake, immediately alert in that way successful people learned. To be. Elena? She turned back to him, and something in her expression must have given away her doubts, because his face fell slightly. You think I'm going to disappoint you? He said quietly. I think you're going to go back to being who you were before Claire died, Elena said honestly. I think grief makes people want to change, but grief fades, and old patterns are comfortable. Marcus stood slowly, moving toward her with deliberate steps. You're probably right. But what if you're not? What if some changes stick? What if meeting you was the thing that finally made me understand what Claire was trying to tell me? Elena felt the pull of wanting to believe him, but forced herself to step back. Then prove it. Not with dinner invitations or extended hospital stays. Prove it by actually changing your life, not just talking about it. How? Elena moved toward the door, then paused. Start by going home, Marcus. Back to your real life. If you can figure out how to be the person you've been in this room when you're surrounded by all the things that made you someone else, then maybe we can talk about dinner. As she left room 314 for what might be the last time, Elena wondered if she was being wise or just scared. In the elevator, her reflection looked tired and uncertain. A woman who'd spent 4 nights learning that the walls between different worlds were both higher and more fragile than she'd ever imagined. A new foundation. 3 weeks passed before Elena saw Marcus again. She'd followed his discharge in the business news, photos of him leaving St. Catherine's in a sleek black car, returning immediately to a series of high-profile meetings. So, Marcus Blackwood, who appeared in those photographs, looked exactly like the man she'd expected to meet that first night. Polished, distant, untouchable. Elena told herself she wasn't disappointed. She'd been right to challenge him, right to protect herself from getting pulled into a world where she'd always be an outsider. She picked up extra shifts, threw herself into her work, and almost convinced herself that those late-night conversations had been an aberration, grief making them both vulnerable to a connection that couldn't survive in daylight. Then, on a Thursday evening, she walked into Rosita's diner after her shift and found Marcus sitting in a corner booth, looking entirely out of place and completely at ease with it. He was still wearing an expensive suit, but he'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. His hair was slightly mussed, and he was drinking what appeared to be terrible coffee from a chipped mug while reading a paperback book. Around him, the usual crowd of hospital workers, night shift factory employees, and insomniacs carried on. Their conversations, occasionally glancing his way, but mostly accepting his presence with the indifference of people too tired to be impressed by wealth. Elena hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to approach or slip back out before he noticed her. But Marcus looked up at that moment, as if he'd been waiting, and his face broke into the kind of genuine smile she'd rarely seen in the hospital. Elena. He stood as she approached, a gesture that felt both formal and oddly natural. Thank you for coming. You texted me from my own suggestion, she said, sliding into the booth across from him. That's either very presumptuous or very clever. Probably both, Marcus admitted. I wasn't sure you'd show up. Elena studied his face, looking for signs of the polished businessman or the broken man she'd first encountered. Instead, she found something new, someone who looked genuinely uncertain but hopeful. So what's this about? Are you here to prove a point? Maybe. Or maybe I'm here because I've discovered I actually like terrible coffee and duct-taped booths. Marcus gestured around the diner with something that might have been fondness. I've been coming here twice a week since I left the hospital. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, usually. The night manager, Carmen, makes sure I get this booth now. Why? Marcus was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug in his hands. Because you were right. About everything. I went back to my penthouse, back to my office, back to the life I'd built, and it felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit anymore. I kept thinking about what you said, about proving I could be the person I was in that hospital room when I was surrounded by all the things that made me someone else. Elena felt something cautious and hopeful stirring in her chest. And I realized I couldn't do it alone. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. I started here, though, with something Claire would have wanted. Elena unfolded the clipping, a small article from the local arts section about the Marcus and Claire Blackwood Foundation, established to fund art programs in underserved schools and provide studio space for emerging artists. The accompanying photo showed Marcus at a press conference, but he wasn't wearing his usual corporate smile. He looked serious, purposeful, real. It's not just a tax write-off, Marcus said quickly, as if anticipating her cynicism. I mean, yes, there are tax benefits, but I'm involved. I visit the schools, I talk to the kids, I review grant applications myself. Last week, a 10-year-old named Destiny showed me a painting of her neighborhood that was so beautiful, it made me cry in front of 20 people. Elena studied the article, then looked back at Marcus. This is good. Really good. But it's also the kind of thing wealthy people do to feel better about their wealth. What about the harder stuff? Marcus's smile was rueful. You mean like completely restructuring my company to prioritize work-life balance? Like instituting mandatory vacation time and hiring 3 additional executives so I'm not personally involved in every decision? Like moving out of my penthouse and into a normal apartment in Brooklyn, 6 blocks from where Claire used to live? Elena blinked, not sure she'd heard correctly. You moved to Brooklyn? 2-bedroom apartment above a bakery. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, makes sure I eat actual meals instead of protein bars. My neighbors argue about parking spaces and invite me to barbecues. It's nice, messy and loud and real in ways I'd forgotten existed. Elena felt the careful walls she'd built around her expectations beginning to crack. And your company? Still profitable, still growing, but differently. My employees seem happier, which has actually improved productivity. Who knew people work better when they're not terrified of taking sick days? Marcus's expression grew more serious. But the real test wasn't changing my business practices or where I live. It was figuring out who I am when I'm not running from something. And who are you? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out the diner's grease-stained window at the parking lot full of beat-up cars and delivery trucks. I'm someone who wants to matter to people who matter to me. Someone who wants to build something lasting that isn't just about accumulating more. Someone who thinks the most interesting. Conversations happen after midnight with someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong. Elena felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Marcus. I know this is complicated, he continued. I know we come from different worlds, and I know I have a lot to prove, but I also know that sitting in this terrible diner, drinking coffee that tastes like it was made yesterday, talking to you is the most real I've felt in years. Elena looked around the familiar space, at Carmen wiping down tables, at the nurse from pediatrics reading a romance novel in the next booth, at the maintenance worker from her building who always nodded hello. This was her world, unglamorous, and honest and comfortable in its imperfections. But Marcus didn't look like an intruder anymore. He looked like someone who was learning to belong, not by buying his way in, but by showing up consistently, by being present without trying to change. Everything around him to suit his comfort. So what are you asking me? Elena said finally. I'm asking if you'd be willing to find out what happens when 2 people from different places meet somewhere in the middle. I'm asking if you'd let me take you to dinner. Not at some fancy restaurant, but maybe at that Ethiopian place your friend Rosa keeps posting about on social media. I'm asking if you'd trust me enough to discover whether what we found in that hospital room can exist in the real world. Elena looked at this man who'd somehow managed to surprise her by actually changing, by doing the hard work of becoming someone worth knowing rather than just someone worth impressing. She thought about her father, who'd never learned that success meant more than just working harder, and about Claire's paintings of people trying to find their way back to each other. "Okay," she said finally, "but I'm buying my own dinner." Marcus's smile was brilliant. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As they sat in the diner, planning their first official date with the enthusiasm of teenagers and the caution of adults who'd learned that the best things in life required patience and care, Elena realized that sometimes the most profound changes happen not in moments of dramatic revelation, but in the quiet decision to keep showing up, to keep trying, to keep building something real, one conversation at a time. Outside, the city hummed with its endless energy, full of people working, through the night, chasing their own versions of enough. But inside Rosita's diner, two people who'd learned to see past their own walls sat planning a future built on the radical idea that love wasn't about having everything in common, but about choosing to build something meaningful from their differences. The end.